Thank you for joining us for today's webinar hosted by DISA and the American Trucking Association's ATA. Speaking to you all today is going to be Dan Horvath, Vice President of Safety Policy at ATA, and Stephen Spencer, General Manager of DISA Transportation. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started today. All attendees will be receiving a copy of today's presentation slides and the recording of the webinar. If you have any questions during the presentation, you may submit your question in the comments section and we will follow up on all questions submitted after the webinar. We also have a short survey at the end if you could just let us know how we did today. And with that, I can go ahead and introduce you to Stephen Spencer with DISA, our General Manager of DISA Transportation Compliance.
Thanks, Mackenzie. Appreciate it. Hello, everyone, and thanks again for joining us today. As Mackenzie mentioned, my name is Stephen Spencer, and I am the General Manager of the Transportation Compliance Group here at DISA. If we can go on to the next slide, you'll be able to see some information about DISA and some of our background. So I'll give you a minute to look over that, but I would like to say, with the continuously changing landscape and regulatory and the regulations and compliance area, we're excited to be able to bring you this regulatory update from American Trucking Association. So Dan, with that, short and sweet, I'm just going to turn it over to you and let you take it away. That's why they're really here today.
Well, thank you, Stephen, and thanks to the folks at DISA for inviting me today. I've spoken to the group before, so unfortunately we're not doing these in person, but this is the next best thing. But again, I appreciate having me today. Before we get into the nuts and bolts of the presentation, a little background on me. As mentioned, I'm the Vice President of Safety Policy here at the American Trucking Associations. Been on board with ATA about 3 years. Prior to that, worked on the motor carrier side as a safety director for about 5.5 years. And then before all that, as a safety auditor for US DOT. So a little bit of a background from the enforcement side, the operations side, and now the association life. Proud to say I have my CDL. I don't drive anymore. They won't let me into trucks anymore, go figure. But it's been a great experience. And one of the great things about doing these presentations, especially when we get back to doing them in person, is that I can learn a lot from the industry to find out kind of what you all are going through it. So I encourage you to ask questions through the chat box. If we don't get to them today, we'll be happy to follow up, and I'll give you my contact information at the end. But with that, the slide on your screen now is just one that every time I do these presentations, I cringe at it, and I can't wait for the day that I can actually remove this. And it's unfortunately COVID-19. I mean, that's been the talk of the industry now for over a year. I can tell you back in February of 2020, what I thought of COVID-19 definitely wasn't what I, ended up happening and what I know of now. I was appointed the head of our task force here at ATA last year for COVID-19. And at that point, it was, we'll coordinate emails, messaging to members, but we really didn't think we were going to be doing a whole lot of work. And boy, were we wrong. I was wrong in it. So we spent a good amount of time working with federal agencies through all of the, initial onslaught of COVID-19, and dealing with some of the reactionary things now. So, but I did want to give you kind of an update of where we're at today. It's funny, COVID-19 happened, and as we get to finally nearing the end of the tunnel of that, we start dealing with other things such as closing of the Colonial Pipeline, which fortunately reopened yesterday. So it's been a fun week here at ATA. We're actually preparing for our first in-person meeting that begins this Saturday in Texas. But it's been a fun week, but hey, that's why we're in a trucking game, because it's something new every day. But I digress. So I do want to kind of go over COVID-19 waivers, where we're at today, what I know of the waivers that are in place. And, I'll talk primarily today from the perspective of motor carriers. So trucking and bus operators would be applicable to most of this. So if you do hear me talking, that's typically what I'm referring to when I speak of a lot of this stuff. But the waivers that are in place now, the majority of them are set to expire the end of this month. So May 31st of this year. And these are the waivers that have really been in place since COVID-19 began. They've typically been about 3 or 4 month waivers and have been extended multiple times. The latest round of extensions happened earlier this year, set for May 31st to expire. If it was about a month ago, I'd say the likelihood of them being extended was probably pretty low. Why I say that, FMCSA indicated in their latest extension that they were going to try and wind down these waivers as soon as possible. I'm hearing rumors, though, that they may be extended beyond May. From what I'm hearing, we don't know for sure yet. Nothing's been official. We are checking in on a daily basis. If they do extend, they may narrow some of the waivers down to make it more applicable. We don't know. I mean, I'd really be kind of guessing at this point. But what I'll tell you, though, is if you are utilizing any of these waivers on the screen, so like the first one, the Hours of Service National Emergency Declaration, this one was really the first one that was issued. And this basically said that if you're engaged in providing direct assistance, emergency assistance, as a result of COVID-19, so such as the restocking of store shelves, transporting the vaccine, transporting medical supplies, you could be exempt from the Hours of Service regulations, among other regulations in that declaration. So if you are using that, that's set to expire May 31st. With all of these waivers, I do encourage you that if any of them appear to be something that you may be able to take advantage of, make sure you're reading the fine print. A lot of these are very specific. Actually, all of these are very specific as far as who is applicable. For instance, on that emergency declaration, if you're doing routine grocery store deliveries, the DOT doesn't consider that emergency restocking of store shelves. Now, how do you determine if it's emergency restocking? That's a whole different kind of discussion that some carriers are trying to figure out. But my point being, don't assume this is a blanket exemption that you might be able to qualify under. The second one listed there, commercial driver's license, commercial learner's permits, and medical certificate validity waivers. These were the extensions having to do with CDL, CLP, and MedCard expiration periods. That's all been pushed out based on when the documents were issued. On the CDL and CLP side, be sure you check with the state that the driver is licensed in. I say that just because some states have decided not to issue extensions. Licensing is a state discussion or a state managed process. Basically with this, FMCSA is just saying we're not going to penalize a state if they choose to extend the expiration period. So it is important that you check with your state agency on that. And the last two, I'm not going to go through the details of these, but these are specific to commercial learner's permits, CLP, and requirements of when a driver gets their license, who has to be in the cab with them at all times, and that type of thing. So again, make sure you're checking the fine print on these. Don't assume it just applies to you. We have heard of cases where carriers have been stopped and they think that they fall under the waiver, but really they don't. Another exemption, and this is nearing a year old, but I do want to mention this just because it's relevant today. Last year, FMCSA issued really what was considered guidance on drug and alcohol testing as far as random testing goes. And what FMCSA said that if you are having difficulties getting your drivers in for a drug and or alcohol test, you should document the reasons why. And that way, if you are audited during this calendar year, which would refocus on the previous calendar year's drug and alcohol testing, you will have the legitimate reasons to prove why your driver couldn't get in for a test. This wasn't a blanket exemption that said you don't have to test it to 50%. In fact, the waiver even said you still need to pull drivers at 50% for drug, 10% for alcohol. But it was simply stating that if you could not get a driver in due to COVID-related concerns, whether the clinic was closed, a lot of clinics, only were doing essential services, that type of thing, you should document the reason why, and you will, hold up in a compliance review if you are audited. Key point again, last being employers capable of meeting these requirements must continue to do so. So this would apply to the previous testing year, so 2020. And last but not least, on the COVID front, I did want to kind of go through some things we've been working on most recently. We have been advocating to set up mobile vaccination clinics across the country, utilizing truck stops. Certainly, it's difficult to tell a truck driver who's over the road that, hey, you need to be back at your home state at this date and time to get the vaccine, especially if it's the dual dose. I know we're having issues with Johnson & Johnson now, but if it was the dual dose, telling a driver or scheduling a driver to get back to that same location could be fairly problematic. So we went the route of working with our truck stop operators specifically with NATSO, who oversees the Association of Truck Stop Operators, to set up mobile clinics across the country. Iowa 80, the big famous truck stop on Interstate 80 in Iowa, just started doing this. We're hearing some evidence of other states that have started doing this as well. So this is great news. Our kind of stance on this from the start has been make the vaccine available for drivers. And that way they can, if they choose to, they can get it and have it done a little bit easier out on the road as compared to needing to be back home. We haven't advocated, nor will we likely advocate for whether drivers should get the vaccine or not. That's been an interesting topic. Unfortunately, we've had several drivers call in here and say, you can't force me to get the vaccine. And, my response is, we're not forcing anybody. We just want to make it available for those who choose to get it. We're also looking at some other state-run facilities, the possibility of setting up clinics across the country. And I think this is definitely going to become more and more widely, kind of spread throughout the country from a positive tone as we have more and more of the vaccine available for industry to obtain. Second bullet point, CDC TSA mask requirements for transportation. This was a fun one. So the CDC and TSA several months back in January issued basically a requirement for when you are required to wear a mask when engaged in transportation. And I'd say 95% of this applied to public transportation. So buses, trains, rail, airport was how it worked, and basically put the establishment that said it's a federal requirement to wear a mask while engaged in those modes of transportation. What it also went on to do, which caused a slew of problems, was it said that if you are a solo truck and or bus driver, you are exempt from the requirements to wear a mask if you are driving by yourself. So that begged the question, well, what about team drivers? So we had a number of our operations that came forward and said, hey, I'm engaged in a team operation. We have husband and wife teams. We have folks from the same household. Are we really expected to tell them to wear a mask in the cab of the truck the entire time? And the answer was, based on the guidance, yes, they were required. So we did finally seek guidance. We got that last month in April from CDC. And what CDC said was that team drivers from the same household are exempt. First question I got from that is, what's considered a household? If you use your imagination, you could consider the truck a household for some period of time. So I think that curbed a lot of the questions that had come up from the mask requirements. And last but certainly not least, OSHA. We do expect an emergency temporary standard to emerge any day now, could even be this week. And this would set standards in place for employers in dealing with workplace health and illness issues related to COVID-19. We do expect more guidance and recommendations to come from OSHA, not just in the trucking world, but as employers generally start to have folks come back to the office as we near the end of the pandemic. I do encourage you, if you do have any questions, to go to our website. We have a pretty great resource put together, our COVID-19 hub. This was just one of the quick examples of something we did in the first weeks of COVID-19, put together a dedicated website where we could put information up. We were tracking state by state and who was prioritized for the vaccine. That's becoming a little less relevant now, as a lot of states have shifted to opening the doors to anybody who wants to receive it. But there is a lot of other useful information up there, so I encourage you to visit our website. Open to non-ATA members, but feel free to check that information out. All right, so let me take a sip of water. We'll shift gears here out of COVID-19 and into the fun stuff like electronic logging devices. Everybody always asks, where are we with ELDs and are they making a difference? And somehow my screen stopped sharing, so let's redo this. Was that me? Let's see here. The joys of doing this stuff remote and figuring out how to deal with it on the fly. Let's skip to where we were. All right, I think we're good. I still see we have participants, so unless I'm told otherwise, I'm going to continue talking and hope that everyone's still here. I was saying electronic logging devices. Everybody keeps asking, where are we with ELDs? Are they making an impact on safety? And I can tell you what we know now. So let me actually shift my, there we go. You should see my whole screen now. So what we do know at this point is ELDs have had an impact on, basically hours of service compliance. And they have led to a drop in hours of service violations as far as your significant violations. So your drive time and, your on-duty time limits, things of that nature. So if you can see the screen here, you see that we had a pretty significant drop right after ELDs went into effect in December of 2017. That continued a little bit of a downward trend into April of 2018. April, why that matters is that was when the out of service criteria went into effect for ELDs. So if you didn't have an ELD and you were required to have one, if you were stopped at an inspection, this is the violation you would have been cited for. And a pretty steady kind of, decline in the violations are steadied out there. Violations dropped by more than half. Little bit of an uptick in the beginning of 2020. And then you see that V-shaped drop where we went down to 0.27% of the violations, obviously as a result of COVID-19, and a little bit of an uptick since then through January of this year. I do have an updated chart. It's not on here now, but it's updated as far as March of this year. We're seeing a little bit of a trend upwards. And what I'm assuming, and this is really an assumption more than anything, is that with COVID-19 and some of the waivers being out there, I'm wondering how many drivers may have been utilizing the hours of service waivers, but they really should not have been. So that's a question that we're kind of digging into to see if that's driving what some of the uptick is. The numbers on your screen here, this is ELD compliance and hours of service violations. So these are the top 5 violations as of the beginning of March. So you can see the first one on there, false report of driver's record of duty status. Folks ask me, why would we have false report of driver's record of duty status if we have ELDs? And the big chunk of what that is are personal conveyance violations. So drivers saying they are in personal conveyance, but they're really not. They're cited for it, and it's considered a false log. So we had about 10,000 violations through March of this year on that. The second one on there, record of duty status, that's RODS, commonly referred to, form and manner violations. I think the big comparison here would be from 2017 before ELDs to 2018. Look, we went from 171,000 to 81,000, and it dropped even after that into 2019. With less paper logs and more electronic, we're going to have less violations take place. Record of duty status, ELD required. The third one on the list, that would be what you are cited for if your driver was stopped, they did not have an ELD, and they were required to have an ELD. And then the last 2 on the list, ELD records. ELD cannot transfer ELD records electronically, and driver record of duty status not current. That often fluctuates with a few other violations in the top 5 list. Another one of those being that the ELD device is not in a secure and mounted positions. So this just kind of gives you the lay of the land of where we are for hours of service ELD violations specifically. It's important to note, if you do work with motor carriers that are operating into Canada, the Canadians do have an ELD rule that goes into effect June of this year. This requires you to have an ELD that's compliant by Canadian standards, which is the kicker here. The biggest difference, it was done very similar to the US rule, but the biggest difference is in Canada, they are requiring a third-party certification of your ELD. So here in the US, ELD providers can go in and they self-certify. In Canada, that's a third-party process. So if your drivers are operating into Canada, you want to make sure that you check with your ELD provider to make sure that they are certified or will be certified with the Canadian rules. There is going to be a soft enforcement period. It's going to consist of education and awareness, as we're told by Canada. They're working to harmonize all of this now. But again, US-based carriers with cross-border operations will need to have an ELD that's certified by Canada. Related, we did have an hours of service rule that went into effect last year, specifically on September 29th. There were 4 new changes in the hours of service rules. Why this one was a little bit different as compared to past rulemakings on hours of service is in the past, there have been new restrictions introduced or new kind of concepts of the hours of service rules. What this one did is it looked at the existing rules and said, what can we do within the rules to tweak them and make them more flexible? There was a lot of complaints as a result of ELDs. We're now counting minutes and seconds. We can't fudge our logs maybe as much as we used to in the past. So this is what ultimately drove an hours of service rule change. And the 4 provisions: short haul, adverse driving conditions, 30-minute rest break, split sleeper berth, were changed or amended within the regulations. The one I have listed there on the bottom, split duty day provision, I have that highlighted in red. That did not make it into the final rule. That was a provision that was included in the proposed rulemaking, but ultimately stripped from the final rule due to a lack of data. We may see a pilot program introduced on that. There's been a notice and comment period already out there on it. Nothing's been formally introduced yet, but that is something the agency may do going forward. So even though the rule is in effect now, we do have some potential for challenges of the rule, which is not surprising. Back in June of last year, a number of safety groups filed concerns regarding the hours of service final rule. And then in September of last year, as expected, I don't think any of this was a surprise. The lawsuit was filed by the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, Advocates for Highway and Auto Safety, Parents Against Tired Truckers, and Citizens for Reliable and Safe Highways. They filed a lawsuit challenging the hours of service final rule. Basically, it was an appeal. They said these rules allow drivers to work longer and drive further, which we don't necessarily agree with. But regardless of that lawsuit, in September, the rules became effective. But what happens now? So the lawsuit just doesn't go away. The agency does need to respond to that. Most recently, back in February, Fmcsa asked for a really what's considered like a stay of the lawsuit, or a pause of the lawsuit. And that was in response to the new administration. Fmcsa has new leadership on board. They said, we need 60 days plus to review this information before we formulate a response. That was granted. So we'll wait to see what happens going forward with that. I have in there that there are attempts within legislative efforts to strip the final rule changes and revert back to the old rules. We think from our perspective that the final rule was pretty good at getting things right with it. I mean, we didn't agree with everything, but quite honestly, for the groups that filed the lawsuits, nothing short of reducing the hours of service rules to make drivers drive less would have appeased those efforts. So it'll be interesting to see what the agency does going forward, and we remain engaged in those conversations. A couple of other hours of service related items I do want to cover here very briefly. For those of you that are engaged in transporting agricultural commodities, you know that the definition of an agricultural commodity that was on the books was not very specific. In fact, it was incredibly vague. The previous definition was agricultural commodity. So the imagination could go hog wild there, pun intended, to figure out what an agricultural commodity was. That definition was updated in November 19th of last year. It became effective in December of last year. And I have the definition listed there on the screen, and really drills down to non-processed food, feed, fiber, livestock, and then other goes on to horticultural products, things that are risk for perishing, and so on and so forth. So if you're engaged in this industry, this definition helps a lot to know who is applicable. Why does it matter? It's because for agricultural commodities, they are afforded some exemptions, such as the hours of service rules and ELD devices. So that's why having a more specific definition was very critical, and we applaud the agency for going forward with that. Related, the agency just published, I don't know why this keeps happening here. Let's bring it up again here. Sorry about that. So I'm going to bring it up from my desktop that way. That way we'll see if we avoid the issue there. Okay, where were we? Okay, let's see if we can make this work. Sorry about that. So yard moves. There was some regulatory guidance proposed by Fmcsa. Let me go back here. That looked at yard moves and what was considered a yard, how to better clarify it, and that ultimately was proposed guidance. We commented on from ATA's perspective. In that blue box on the right, what Fmcsa had proposed was to include intermodal yard or port facilities, a motor carrier's place of business, a shipper's privately owned parking lot, a public road only if and while access to the road is restricted through traffic control measures. And then we also commented and added that we should consider geographical locations and also actions that constitute a yard move. We had our retail stores asked that they be included in what is considered a yard. Again, the big question is, why does it matter what a yard is or is not? Well, it comes down to hours of service, and it comes down to whether you log that time as driving or on duty not driving. When you utilize on duty not driving, you don't eat away at your drive time. You can save some drive time for later down the road. So that was a proposed regulatory guidance revision. We've not seen anything come from the agency yet on that. So we'll wait to see if that's published and made final. All right, so shifting gears out of COVID-19, hours of service, ELD type stuff to some other regulatory updates that are going on and on the books. CSA. This is one that we really haven't talked about in some time, at least from the perspective of CSA and the tracking, but more so from the perspective of the crash preventability program. So for those of you that are engaged in this at all, you know that crashes, DOT recordable crashes, whether they are your fault or not, end up on your CSA profile. Doesn't seem all that fair. Industry has been kind of griping about this for a number of years, rightfully so. What they did was they introduced, Fmcsa introduced a crash preventability program. It was originally a demonstration program, meaning really it was a temporary program, and that was made final, a permanent program in May of last year. It introduced 10 different crash types that can be reviewed. Here are those crash types on your screen. I'm not going to read down word for word, but your crash, in order for it to be challenged by DOT, has to meet one of these 10 criteria. If it does not, it is not eligible for review. It doesn't mean that you were necessarily at fault. It just means that it doesn't meet one of the 10 criteria and DOT isn't going to review it. And that's really comes down to manpower. When you have every single crash on there or just allow a carrier to submit anything, DOT has to review each and every one of these. It's a little bit more in depth than the data queue process for roadside inspection violations. That's why they have this specific list of 10 different crash types that need to be challenged. A lot of these are grouped into different categories, or rather similar categories, such as wrong direction or illegal turns, parked or illegally stopped, animal strikes. Number 10 on there, rare or unusual crashes. You probably heard me say this before. I asked Fmcsa, what would you consider a rare or unusual crash? An example they gave me was hitting a skydiver who had landed on the highway in front of a truck. It happened in the real world. That's a rare or unusual crash. That made the list, and that was an example. Number 10 is not meant to be used as a catch-all category. So that's important to know that just because it doesn't meet the other 9, you can't throw it in that number 10 slot and think that it's going to be automatically reviewed. For compliance, safety, accountability in and of itself, what's going on behind the scenes with the methodology? You know that we've been talking about this for a number of years since CSA was introduced in 2014. The original intent of CSA was to identify carriers, motor carriers, that are at risk for future crashes. But CSA really wasn't doing it that accurately. There was inconsistency with the reporting, and then the data reporting became public, and it was just a whole ordeal with it. So it ultimately led to multiple government accountability studies. The Office of Inspector General got involved, and basically in the end, they said that the methodology, the math behind the scenes of CSA is not accurate in predicting future crash risk, and they need to revise the methodology. So Fmcsa proposed to go with what was considered or called the IRT model. That's technical terms for item response theory. It's methodology that's used by analysts in other fields. Our folks, or Fmcsa folks, said that might be plausible for the industry for trucking. They introduced that. Pardon the sirens as they go by outside my window. That's a frequent thing here in Arlington, Virginia. But I digress. So on CSA, where we're at today is we really don't have an update. Fmcsa is still working behind the scenes to see if IRT is the way to go, if that math will be better than the math we have currently. I have a bullet point in here. Has industry grown accustomed to the way it is? And, really is, we've grown to deal with it, even if it is flawed. So it's interesting to see what will happen if Fmcsa will do anything. The last update was September of last year, and changes were yet to be implemented. So we will wait and see what happens with the agency going forward. Drug and alcohol testing. So this is relevant for this group. I do want to cover some updates on the drug and alcohol side here, and probably start with the top regulatory legislative advocacy item for ATA, and that's hair testing. We've been advocating at ATA for hair testing for a number of years. And this even goes back to the FAST Act mandating that Congress, mandating the use of hair testing for the trucking industry. So it's a little bit nuanced in how this works. Before DOT can implement or allow hair testing, they need to first have standards from the Health and Human Services Department, so HHS. HHS kind of dragging their feet on this. We had been pushing for it. In November of last year, or rather September of last year, HHS finally published the standards. And unfortunately, they were very flawed by what we viewed them to be. And we really don't think they're going to work for industry. And why I say that is HHS proposed an alternative specimen testing for positive hair tests. So I'll walk through a scenario here. Under HHS's proposal, if you have a truck driver that has a positive hair test, and let's assume it's for a random drug test. If the hair test is positive, that driver would then need to have a secondary test of either a urinalysis or oral fluids. If the urinalysis or oral fluids is positive, then the driver would have to report that test out as negative. I'm sorry, let me say that again. If the secondary test is negative, you have to report it out as negative. So you're going to have cases where you have a positive hair test and a negative urinalysis, and you got to go with the negative urinalysis. And if there's anything we know about hair testing, it's that hair testing has a much greater detection window. It goes back much further than urinalysis. It's much harder to cheat, so to speak, when taking the test. So we think this is incredibly flawed. But HHS was adamant on this. So we filed some comments voicing our concerns with it. We think that there is unlikely that positive hair test would be allowed in the clearinghouse, which we'll talk about here in the next slide. There's also other issues with it, such as the acceptance only of head hair for testing purposes and not facial or body hair, and really just a flawed rule from our perspective, and something that we think really questions into the whole science of hair testing to begin with. They're often citing a past case where there were some hair testing concerns raised with the Boston Police Department, and really just a bad rule. And it focuses on hair testing being the 90% of hair testing that are likely to be negative versus the 10% that are positive, and it doesn't accurately address the trucking's concerns with this. If DOT were to do anything with hair testing, this would need to get fixed before they do so. So we're working the legislative front and the advocacy and regulatory side to try and get this fixed. So as I said, if you have a positive hair test today, you cannot report that to the Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse because it's not a DOT recognized test. So we have the clearinghouse, it's in place now, it's operational. January 2021 marked the 1-year anniversary of the Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse, and we're happy to have that in place. It is unfortunately catching many violations, which I'll go through those numbers here in a second. But if anything, it's identified a huge loophole that has existed for a number of years in the DOT drug and alcohol testing world. And that loophole merely being that drivers were easily able to skirt the system. If they tested positive one carrier, they were able to easily get a job somewhere else and avoid detection. If you've not actually been into the clearinghouse website, this screenshot here are some of the slides that I pulled. I went in and ran a query on myself. I have a CDL. I wanted to see how the process works. If all the information is accurate, you will get results back in a matter of seconds. And again, that's if your driver's license information, everything is entered correctly. Fortunately, I got results that I did not have any violations. Otherwise, that would have been a little bit awkward conversation for ATA. But this is what it looks like running the violation or the report for each driver. As far as numbers go, the question is, how many drivers have tested positive? And as of the beginning of April, this data is reported monthly by DOT, but as of the beginning of April, there were 69,100 drug violations in the clearinghouse. So just shy of 70,000. I would bet money that when we see the May report, which should be any day now, that number is going to be well over 70,000. Of that 69,000, 57,000 were actually positive drug tests versus about 10,000 that were refusals, and then 1,600 that were actual knowledge violations. No surprise here, marijuana being the top the top drug for the drug test, 29,000 of those violations in 2020. Second on the list, cocaine. Third, methamphetamine. Fourth, amphetamines. I don't think that's a surprise at all there. The one that just scares the crap out of me is the last one on there. MDA. I mean, 30 violations in 2020. That's pretty scary to think a driver on MDA out there. So those are the drug violations. Not to forget that the clearinghouse also tracks alcohol violations. There were 1,552 alcohol violations in the clearinghouse as of the beginning of April. 950 were actual concentration where it was over 0.04, keeping in mind it's 0.04 for CDL holders, 369 refusals, and then 233 actual knowledge. Actual knowledge in many cases, witnessing a driver actually consume alcohol, things of that nature. So the number that we're really starting to focus on more so than the violations, and folks are asking is, are these numbers surprising? And while shocking, I think they're about on par with what the agency had predicted as far as violations. The number we're focusing on from ATA's perspective is how many of those drivers that have violations are completing the return to duty process to return back to work. Nobody ever said that just because you have a violation doesn't mean you can't drive a truck ever again. There is a return to duty process. We realize that not all carriers will bring a driver back on after a violation, especially with the litigation concerns. But we do hope to see the number of drivers that complete the return to duty process to increase. There are 64,846 drivers in the system today with at least one violation. You may ask, I said 69,000 earlier. Why is it the number 64 here? This is drivers with at least one violation. That other number captures total violations. So of that number, 54,237 are in a prohibited status, meaning they have not completed the return to duty process. They may have started it, but 41,029 have not started it. And of all those numbers, 10,609 drivers who have had a previous violation, have completed the return to duty process, are eligible to return back to work, are in a not prohibited status. The last number on your screen, I'll point out, follow-up testing plan. This is part of kind of the return to duty process. After you return back to work, you take your return to duty drug test. You are subject to follow-up testing, a plan, which is typically a year, sometimes longer. So that number is at 0. That's not really surprising there, just because a driver would have had to have a violation a year ago, done everything in this 1 year, and then been reported back to the system. So we'll be tracking those numbers going forward to see if those are increases at all. All right, some medical driver qualifications that I do want to cover here before we transition to some other things. On the medical side, we are talking about the National Registry. Again, for those of you that haven't been entirely in the loop, you remember back in 2015 when this rule kind of went into place, the National Registry had what was referred to as a National Registry 2.0 component. And that 2.0 component was the automation of the driver's credentials, the medical card, to the state. So in April, Fmcsa announced that there were, due to a number of delays, including an attempt at hacking, that they were going to push the medical certificate information electronically, that process was going to be pushed back to June 22nd of 2021. We will be coming and going from that compliance date. And just here recently in April of this year, Fmcsa announced a further delay until June 23rd, 2025. So I just threw a ton of dates out at you, probably confused the heck out of you. So this chart kind of lays it out of how this will work after June 22nd, 2025. So again, it was supposed to happen this year. It's been delayed another 4 years to 2025. But once this is into place, hopefully in 2025, when a driver passes his or her medical exam, that medical card will automatically be submitted to Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. FMCSA will receive that information, and then they will electronically pass that information to the state driver's license agency. So then later at a roadside inspection, when the driver stopped, everything should be on the driver's SIDless MVR record. That happens kind of today, but you or your drivers are taking care of that processing of information. So how it works today is when your driver gets a medical card, they turn it into the motor carrier, and the motor carrier says to the driver, hey, did you send it into the state? The driver either says yes, or some motor carriers in many cases transmit the data for them by uploading it via email. Some have an online portal, but it is done by state process. So you're doing that today. This would just automate that process. And it's unfortunate that it's been delayed a little further, but we really hope that the agency does everything they can to make sure that 2025 date holds true. Related to medical standards, we have seen a number of potential regulatory actions and also legislative actions to modify the medical criteria for drivers to operate as CMV. The latest such attempt is a change in the vision standards. This was a proposal from FMCSA in January of this year to amend the vision standards. And basically what it would have done was it would have said that drivers with vision impairments would no longer need to obtain an exemption from FMCSA. Today, if a driver does not meet the vision standards, they have to go through an exemption process from FMCSA. This would remove that exemption process, propose an alternative vision standard, which would ultimately replace the exemption program. We at ATA filed comments on that in March. We weren't too thrilled with the proposal, and I can tell you the reason being that it kind of shifted the focus from medical examiners to the motor carrier. So one part of the process was it said that a driver with vision impairment first needs to go to an optometrist, then they can go and get their med card. And then after that, it's up to the motor carrier to actually do a driving test, a road test, to ensure that the driver's vision does not impact their ability to operate as CMV. And on that side of things, for those of you that have been engaged in the operational side, I mean, doing a road test is, you'd have to be pretty darn skilled to give a 20-minute road test and determine whether a driver's vision is going to impact him or her. Not to mention, if you do the road test during the daytime, does that say anything about doing a road test at nighttime when vision is much more difficult? So we had a lot of question marks with that. And then finally, it really went against the department's medical review board standards that were established a while back on vision standards. So, I don't know if the agency will continue down this path. They may adjust it, but, we're keeping track of whether this passes or not. And I'll reiterate that this has not changed. This was a proposal. That's what an NPRM is. It's not a final rule. Another NPRM that has not yet become final, record of violations. This is part of the driver qualification process. This was a proposal in December of last year from the agency to eliminate the requirement that once a year, a driver furnishes a list of violations that they have had in the previous year. Motor carriers are already required to obtain an annual MVR. We think that the driver furnishing a list of violations is really not necessary. So we amended those we commented that we didn't think that was necessary, and we'll wait to see what the agency does with that going forward. Entry-level driver training. This is just a quick refresher that we are nearing the entry-level driver training compliance date, February 7th, 2022, at which point all drivers entering the industry who have not had a CDL before must go through a structured training curriculum, which is established across the country and includes theory requirements, behind the wheel training, and a number of other requirements. Training providers must register on the training provider registry. If you do your own training, that's fine. You just have to certify yourselves on this TPR and state that you are training drivers to the curriculum established by ELDT. Younger drivers related to ELDT, we continue our advocacy at ATA to push to allow under 21-year-old drivers to operate in interstate commerce. Currently, they can operate within the state today in intrastate commerce. There's my map of my home in Pennsylvania, from Erie, Pennsylvania to Philadelphia, an 18-year-old today can operate a CDL vehicle 420 miles one way, but they cannot operate across state lines into Ohio 35 miles, and we just don't think it makes a whole lot of sense. So we've advocated for the Drive Safe Act, which is legislation that would allow 18 to 21-year-olds to operate in interstate commerce under a very structured training program. It includes 120 training hours of the first probationary period, 280 in the second, for the grand total of 400. Certain safety requirements required to be on the vehicle, such as an experienced driver, who must have held a CDL for the previous 2 years. And then technology requirements on the truck itself, such as automatic emergency braking, active braking, collision mitigation systems, forward-facing video event recorders, and speed governors set at 65. The agency tends to agree with us on under 21-year-olds. They've already proposed a military pilot program that is in place today. I should have said proposed there because it's actually active today. This allows individuals between the ages of 18 and 21 who are members of the armed forces, key point being reservists, who operate heavy machinery in the military, to apply to be a part of this program, and they'd be allowed to operate in interstate commerce. That's active. That's scheduled to conclude January of next year. I would encourage you that if you have anybody within your fleet that would meet this criteria, to go to FMCSA's website and participate. They've also introduced a non-military pilot program. This is a proposal. Comments were due late last year. We've yet to see it fully, announced and introduced. We're hopeful that that does happen. But this is structured just like the Drive Safe Act that I mentioned here earlier. This would allow individuals with, to go through a structured training program and operate in interstate commerce in order to get the data to support a potential rule change. As I said before, this happens today in 49 states across the country. An 18-year-old can obtain their CDL and operate within state lines. We don't see the difference with crossing state lines. We think it can be done so safely with qualified and responsible individuals. All right, so I have, I think, 3 slides left as I wrap things up. Some technology updates. We have been engaged in a program called Techcelerate Now at ATA, working with our industry partners, really to look at the data, look at the technologies that exist out there today. Some key examples: automatic emergency braking, air disc brakes, lane departure warning, driver cameras are among the short list of technologies that Techcelerate Now is digging into. And the goal of this program is really a research and advisory kind of a group to do studies of this data, provide it to motor carriers, and let motor carriers make informed decisions on technologies that exist out there today and what may work best for your fleet. So this is a great option as compared to going the mandated route, which would require motor carriers to adopt this technology. And this provides an incentivized really approach to adopting a lot of this technology. Okay, so last slides. I do want to have, I got Doc and Marty there, Back to the Future, my favorite movie of all time, favorite trilogy. Sorry for the Star Wars fans out there that want to argue, but this is some of the things that we could see happening in a new administration. So while it's May already and we're 5 months into the new administration, there are folks still being appointed to positions. FMCSA still does not have a designated head. We have acting Administrator Mira Joshi. She needs to go through the confirmation process. That's not happened yet, but a lot could happen. These are the regulatory agendas that I pulled from DOT late last year in the fall. These are just items that are on DOT's list of potential rulemaking. We may see it happen. We may not see it happen. It really truly depends on what the agency decides to do. And I said, what about sleep apnea? We will likely see a sleep apnea standard emerge from this new administration, whether it's this year, whether it's next. We've been hearing a lot of talk about it. There's a good chance something would come in, will be coming in the near future. Qualification standards for hearing. That could be something that happens as well. Differences, like I mentioned, vision earlier, changes in qualification standards for hearing. So I'm not going to go through every one of this. I just want to throw these out as a potential for change in the new administration. Oral fluids I have on there, that's something we still wait for DOT to adopt. There's been some issues with lab certifications on this, but we hope to see something emerge in the near future on that. And then last but not least HR2, which is the House Transportation Bill, known as the Moving Forward Act. This was introduced in the previous Congress. We are under the belief that this will be used as the basis for a new House Transportation Bill. And in it, there are safety provisions that some we like, some we don't like. Truck underrides guards, we've raised a lot of concerns about it. Automatic emergency braking, we support that. CSA, this would return CSA scores to public view. We've been opposed to that. Hours of service, as I mentioned, this would roll back to recent changes. We've been opposed to that. Sleep apnea, we support further study of it. We want, if they're going to go down the route of doing something with sleep apnea, we want it to be a rulemaking as compared to guidance. Entry-level driver training, ELDT, that's report language that ensures that the ELDT requirements would go into effect next February. And then finally, marijuana legalization, which is just really a fun one to deal with. We don't weigh in on whether states should allow marijuana legalization or not. We do weigh in, however, to maintain the rights of employers, including the Department of Transportation, to recognize marijuana as a federally prohibited drug and to remain on the panel of drug tests. So with that, the great thing about these online presentations is I can't tell if people are sleeping or not and have fallen, have turned their computers off and things like that. So I'm going to assume you're all still here, you're all still engaged. That's my contact information here on the screen. Feel free to reach out to me, whether it's phone or email. I do have a Twitter handle, which I try and post updates to. But if you're an ATA member or not, I'm welcome your input and look forward to any questions that you may have. So with that, Stephen, I think I will turn it back to you, sir.
Thanks, Dan. Appreciate your time today. Great update. And then I think, Mackenzie, were you going to come on and wrap us up?
Yes, thank you so much, Dan. Thank you, Stephen, for presenting to us today. I just wanted to give a reminder that we will be emailing the presentation slides and the recording out to everyone who's attended today's webinar. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to Dan or Stephen. And any questions that came through in our Q&A, we will be following up with you following the presentation or following today's webinar. And thank you so much. Thank you for joining us, everyone.
Thank you all. I appreciate it.